저희가 사전에 받은 질문 중에서 우선 몇 가지로 좀
So we have some pre-received questions, and we would like to begin with that first.
질문입니다.
So first question goes,
기업들은 이제 요즘 뭐 많은 성장
Many Korean companies now, because especially many listed companies are, so for example, like public corporations. So anyway, so these listed companies and many Korean companies are performing human rights due diligence, mostly according to the RBA, Responsible Business Alliance guidelines. But then today we mostly talked about the UNGPs. So the due diligence based on UNGPs. So then, given that the most Korean companies perform due diligence according to the RBA guideline, then should there be other due diligence according to the UNGPs? So then let me ask Jeremy to respond to this question first.
I'm going to give the honor to my esteemed colleague, Rosa, who will take the first shot at this answer, but thank you.
Right, thank you so much for the question. It's a great question, and it is actually something that we also often hear from our member companies. So the RBA is a great standard, and it's a very important first step for companies to complete RBA audits. They have much value. And one thing is, they do also look at the same set of international human standards as the first step. They look at a lot of the relevant human rights risks, which are also covered under human rights impact assessments under the UNGPs. Maybe one slight difference could be important, and this depends on the country in which your supplier or your operation is being assessed. One thing that is often discussed is RBA tends to look at how well a company's operations adheres to the national regulations in regards to various human rights issues. And in countries where the government is strong, the labor laws are strong, all ILO core conventions have been ratified, enforcement is good. This is not an issue. So the RBA audit is considered as quite comprehensive and adhering to the same international human rights expectations that the UNGPs would expect companies to. However, in certain countries where the labor law is weak, where not all ILO labor conventions have been ratified, or where enforcement of certain issues is weak, then that could be an issue. So that is where sometimes additional human rights due diligence is advised. And this sometimes relates to issues such as the right to the freedom of association and collective bargaining. Sometimes it relates to regulations on minimum wage, et cetera. It really depends on the context. So in some cases, we have actually helped some of our member companies who have already conducted RBA audits to complement this with focused human rights due diligence, again, focusing on certain countries where the labor law is not quite as robust as others. But maybe I'll stop first and ask if Jeremy would like to add on.
I'll add two pieces. And to be clear, I used to work at Nike. And I was around Nike in the late 1990s and early 2000s when a lot of the supply chain compliance work started. And RBA started as a working group inside BSR, actually. I think there's three really interesting pieces that are emerging from human rights and the UN guiding principles processes. Number one, the purpose of the human rights due diligence, particularly on your own company, is about your own ownership and management of those risks to stakeholders. The outcome of a human rights due diligence process could include RBA-style compliance action program elements, but at the end of the day, this is about your company for your needs to implement in your systems based on your footprint. And so the ownership of the human rights due diligence concept should sit with you, not with the RBA. The RBA is a great tool, absolutely no question, but it's about what your company is owning it. And the second one, And this maybe goes back to the very first example that was brought up, was what are the real risks, opportunities, and issues? Harassment for a new hire inside a company. That is mitigatable, that is manageable, that is avoidable with good human resource management systems and processes that are part of how do you think about mitigating human rights issues over the broader term. So in short, this is about your company's ownership and footprint, and the ownership and footprint of your company's supply chain accountable to you, not the RBA.
네, 잘 들었습니다.
So thank you very much for your responses. So let's move on to the second question. So when BSR conducts human rights impact assessments, you talked about prioritization and how to identify priority the risks. So do you happen to use any checklists, maybe for industries or for companies? And also in terms of the stakeholders, how do you perform interviews with them? So there was a question from the participants in advance. So who would like to take the question right now?
Maybe I can start again, and then Jeremy can add on. So again, thank you very much for the questions. Again, very important questions also. So in terms of prioritization, we do have a very long list of the comprehensive list of human rights issues which would be relevant for companies globally. But indeed, as you mentioned, based on the industry, based on the sector, we can quickly shortlist the human rights issues to what is most relevant for that industry. Also, depending on the country in which that particular asset, which is being assessed, is located in, we can also further narrow down the set of human rights risks which we assess. So that's the first step of shortlisting that we look at, and that actually does narrow down usually our initial shortlist, which we come up with after that prioritization, is about 20 issues or so. So it's not long list of 50 issues. No, it actually becomes quite narrow quite quickly, unless you're in a very high risk sector, in a very high risk country, then yes, you might have quite a long list of issues which need to be assessed. In terms of how we conduct stakeholder engagement and also assessing, I guess, which stakeholders we need to talk to. So we do our own research. We also talk to the company, and based on our experience, we have a good understanding of who are the international stakeholders that we think are important to interview to get their perspective on what is relevant, what is going to be relevant in the future for that industry, for that country. Also, we try to interview local, stakeholders within that country as well to get a more in-depth perspective on what is really going on the ground in that country. In terms of internal stakeholders, that's where we rely very heavily on the support of the company that we're assessing. So local management is definitely important. We try to identify which local management teams we should interview. Corporate headquarter management is also key, again, just to make sure we understand both the global level policies and the country level policies. In terms of the workers, again, that's super important. We want to make sure that we interview a lot of workers and a good cross-section of the workers. So female workers, male workers, temporary, permanent, etc. If there are migrant workers present, all nationalities, for example, Indonesian, Bangladeshi, Nepali, etc., to make sure we understand the different experiences. And also, of course, local community members, if relevant. We would also interview a different cross-section, women, men, etc. So again, we don't want to also interview everyone. So we're also very selective, and we work together with a company to make sure that we interview the right combination of workers, other stakeholders in a manageable time frame as well. But hopefully that helps to begin to answer some of your questions. And again, I'll ask Jeremy if you want to add anything.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다. 그 한국 기업들이 이제 인권 실사를 하는
Alright, thank
역사-
you. Now then, for the Korean companies, their human right due diligence history is not that long. But then now the Korean National Human Rights Council, they also came up with a checklist for such due diligence. And it has about like 10 human rights questions. So for example, whether there is child labor, forced labor, freedom of association, whether it is being granted or not. So really the key questions about the human rights. And now for the most companies in Korea, major companies do not find any issues regarding those key issues. So then for the human rights due diligence, rather than actually identifying the actual issues, it's more about like just checking off on the list. So more of a formality, so to speak. Then also there was emphasis on the communication with the stakeholders. And I see that the due diligence is also a conversation, a dialogue between the company and the stakeholders mediated by human rights. So in that process, they can identify human rights issues, can also strengthen their capability to manage human rights issues, and overall improve relations with the stakeholders in that process. But then again, many companies see human rights due diligence as something like a test or exam. So rather than going to in-depth communication with the stakeholders, so they just try to show and they just respond that no, we have no child labor or forced labor, and that is it. So, given this backdrop, I do believe that the responses and the presentations so far have been quite useful for the Korean companies. Now, based on that, one more question in relation to this. Now, the Korean companies, they perform the due diligence on their own in many cases.
So like ESG teams and separate teams would use their checklist to perform the assessment, but PSR, it's a third-party organization that conducts human rights due diligence. What's the rationale for that? Why do we need to have that due diligence? What's the meaning of doing that? Because in the international community, for example, you could do your own company assessments, or you could have a third party conduct the assessments. Are there any differences in terms of the views?
Maybe I can start again and ask Jeremy to add on. So thank you so much. That's a very interesting context and also a very important question. So indeed, a lot of companies do have strong internal human rights teams and expertise. And some of the activities that we do is to help these companies strengthen their internal human rights due diligence system. So that's fine. But there is some benefit and value of having independent human rights impact assessments conducted. And this is particularly in cases, for example, where there have been, say, public issues or conflict, or there are some tensions with external stakeholders, rights holders, or even within the company, for example, if there have been strikes or protests, etc. So sometimes it is valuable to have an independent party conduct these engagements, these interviews, so that we could receive more information from the rights holders about what they think is wrong, about what they think the company has not been doing, if they think that the company has not been listening to them, etc. So sometimes it can be difficult for internal human rights experts to get that same level of frankness or openness compared to an independent third party. And again, we understand also the maybe instinct for companies to tick the box and say no child labor, no forced labor, etc. And again, one of the key things that we want to highlight is indeed a lot of companies have very robust supplier codes of conduct, management systems, etc., which do say zero tolerance of forced labor, child labor, etc. However, more and more expectations are being put forth on companies to demonstrate how they are checking whether or not this is a case, and it's no longer going to be acceptable, I think, just to say there's no forced labor, etc. And independent human rights impact assessments can be one credible source of helping to prove that. Having said that, it's still an expectation for the company to conduct due diligence on an ongoing manner. So an independent human rights impact assessment is helpful, but it does need to be supplemented by systems, as Jeremy mentioned. So you still have to have your own internal checking compliance and reporting. And again, as asked, reporting is very important to demonstrate that you do understand what your risks are, because even the UNGPs, the expectation is not for companies to have zero risk. That's impossible. The expectations is for the company to demonstrate they have a good system to identify what their risks are in their operations and supply chain, and then develop plans to address those risks over time. So again, it's not a test. There will be risks that keep occurring, and that's fine as long as you can show through your management plans how you are planning to address them over time. So maybe I'll stop first and ask Jeremy if you want to add anything.
I'll add a couple pieces. And real briefly. And one is why we're here with Jipyong, which is a law firm. If you think about where due diligence is coming from, in many ways, trying to provide answers to sometimes media inquiries, and where it's going to, legal accountability. If you think about a stock exchange, of course, your company has a finance department that does your own books, but you still have somebody else come in and audit you, because the accountability to your shareholders means you have to have good books. So as you think about where is human rights due diligence going, one is growing accountability to, for example, if you want to import into the US, to your ability to answer questions to US Customs and Border Protection, if necessary. The second one is reliance. Have you done enough? Are you sure you've took all of the blinders off and you're looking robustly, not only at good systems, but where are the problems? Every company has problems. Every company has an issue. Every company will have something come up. Are you learning from taking those and integrating them, which is sometimes really hard for companies to do, in a way that the same way somebody on your board needs to be accountable as head of the audit committee, imagine someone on your board being accountable externally and to your regulators for your human rights due diligence. That's why as you think about what is robust, what is reliable, and what is the emerging accountability, those tell you where this industry is moving towards.
네, 두 분 말씀 잘 들었습니다.
So thank you very much for your responses. I think we could probably have a full day talking about this because there are a lot of agendas that are rising as we speak and as we have this conversation. Especially you talked about reporting, because human rights due diligence is not about just ticking boxes, but it is about communication with the stakeholders, rights holders, as well as reporting. So Korean companies, when they publish sustainability reports, they would have a portions that allocated to human rights assessment. And I was able to take a look at an example of a company. They said that they don't have any child labor, forced labor, and so forth, that they have 0 case of infringement on human rights within their company. And I thought to myself, is it really possible, practically possible? Because human rights infringement, there's 0 case of that. Is that something that you could take pride in? Does it really show objectivity of the assessment? Because internally, if you're communicating very effectively on human rights, you probably would have more numbers than that. So especially maybe they're just going through the formalities of reporting this or communicating to external stakeholders and really taking a deep dive on the issues. Now, there aren't any Korean companies that are actually just publishing separate reports on human rights. I think there was only one company that tried it last year, but I hope that there will be more companies joining the queue in the future. So we allocated only about 1 hour for this webinar. I just realized that we're running behind our schedule, but we would like to just delve into the final one last question before we close.
So as we have talked about so far, especially about the Korean companies, now, in the EU, so EU laws, especially regarding the due diligence, especially the supply chain due diligence, so the Korean companies are highly interested in that. And then also the two of you also mentioned the US Customs and Border Protection, and they can also come up with that requirement to demonstrate and so forth. Now then, looking at these trends in the EU and the US, then how are the Korean companies to prepare for such development? So how should they prepare for them? Who wants to go first?
Maybe I'll start this time. And I'll take both of those questions together in a way. If you have I used to work in factories. If you have a factory with no people in it, you can have 0 accidents and injuries. As soon as you put a person in that factory, you will have a risk and a probability of an accident or injury. Everybody in the world reports time loss incidents per million man hours, or a variant on that. Any company that would tell you we've never had an accident or injury, I wouldn't believe. Because human rights, people. And what we're talking about is how people interact and relate and have opinions and sometimes get grumpy and unhappy and sometimes do bad things. So as we're thinking about reporting, what you need to think about it from the perspective of things will always go wrong. Every company gets sued. So therefore, if things will always go wrong and you have to report, what do you want to report? An audit, no problem, or robust management systems? How do banks look at anti-money laundering? It's not because they go through everything and say, look, we found none, we're good. They look at in 3 lines of control. Do you have robust systems to manage, to functionally engage, to assure that risk? And then even more important, how do you integrate this whole idea of grievance systems, of means of redress, to be able to say, well, of course, we have no perfect management system. When it goes wrong, we have means of finding and making sure we can set it right. So that's my longer answer of we have to think about this from the perspective not of everything's perfect, but the perspective of it's people. Things go wrong. How do we manage through that?
Not sure if we have time to address the second question, or also if our colleagues at GP영 would like to.
네, 맞아 말씀하셔도 됩니다, 선생님.
Please go ahead. You can use your time.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. So yeah, I totally agree with your response about the reporting question. In terms of what Korean companies and other companies can do to start preparing is for the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. So I think basically the UNGPs are still the underlying foundation of those requirements. Basically, these countries want to see, do you have the human rights due diligence framework, which was explained by our colleague Jung-Wook from GP영, like assess impacts, integrate, track, and then communicate. So you have to have all of those elements. There are specific elements which they do expect, for example, a public commitment to human rights, basically human rights policy, or having some commitment to that in your code of conduct or ethics, for example. Also, again, the human rights due diligence framework, grievance mechanisms, as Jerry mentioned, and also access to remedy. That's another key element that they will look at. Do you have an operational grievance mechanism? Are you tracking how effective it is? Are you also tracking and reporting how, you're investigating the complaints, grievances that you received. Of course, we understand not every complaint is valid. Some of them will not be valid, but for those that you find are true or valid, what action did you take to provide remedy? The UNGPs also has criteria which demonstrates this is acceptable remedy. So again, are you also reporting on that? And basically, there are two elements. I think, due diligence is important, and just showing that duty of care, making sure that you're doing what is appropriate in that particular situation. So those are some of the key, expectations. We do have some resources on this, which we can share through our colleagues at JPyong after this presentation. We actually also do have EU mandatory human rights due diligence preparatory checklist. I think that's only for BSR members, however, but we do have resources which we can share publicly, which are a bit longer, but again, you can extract from that what you think is relevant for you to help prepare for the upcoming due diligence regulations. Yeah.
네. 우리 민창욱 변호사님도
All right, now then also Attorney Min. So, the EU or the global legislation trends, if you could also give your input. Right, so in Germany, so the law is already enacted, so it will go into effect soon, starting in 2023, I believe. But then now, actually the EU law, now it is still pending with some discussions underway. But then now for Korean companies that are exporting to the EU, so if they are part of the EU supply chain, then they would be required to conduct due diligence. And actually, even without the law, in the EU, there are a lot of laws that require disclosure of non-financial information, which also includes the supply chain. So for example, in terms of the impact, so I believe that you could also make some preparation for that. And then also in the case of Korea, the Framework Act on Human Rights Policy, it is still a Framework Act, but then it is also likely to be followed up with the enforcement decree or some implementation plans. So I believe that we can also keep up with those changes in Korea as well. All right, thank you. So now we have gone much over time than scheduled. So I believe that it is time for us to wrap up. Now, together with BSR, we have discussed the issue of the human rights due diligence, especially supply chain sustainability. So I truly appreciated this opportunity. Now, of course, in Korea, the business and human rights issues, perhaps we are now only beginning. So for us to think about them, to discuss them, and for the companies to really embrace them as their own issues. So it might take some time, but human rights basically are about respecting, valuing people. So companies, any company that values people will be the company that I want to work for. And if I'm a consumer, then will be the company from whom I want to buy from. So when the human rights issues become business issues, then this will make the businesses more sustainable. And regarding this point, we were able to gain a lot of insight and inspiration. So thank you very much to all the participants.